My boyfriend stole my phone while I slept and sent 300 messages to my ex, pretending to be me. I was still half asleep when I saw all the texts from coworkers and people I never really spoke to, all asking me the same thing. Is everything okay? My mom called me panicking. Honey, I love that you're enthusiastic, but did you really have to spam the book club group chat? My hands started to shake. Mom, let me call you back. I quickly hung up and checked my phone, but it only made me feel more panicked. There were messages I'd never sent, posts I'd never made. But when I saw the 5-star reviews on my boyfriend Marco's business page, I knew exactly who'd done it. I ran downstairs and found him grinning to himself. Good morning, baby. Guess what? He asked excitedly. I got 30 new followers for my car business. Isn't this great? I gave him a half smile. That's great, but Marco, what's this? I showed him the messages sent out while I was asleep, begging people to get their car detailed by my boyfriend. What? Can't support your boyfriend? 6 months I've been begging you to help me and you do nothing. My mouth hung open. Do nothing? I designed your logo, made your business cards. I even got you 3 customers. I argued. 3 customers in 6 months? That's pathetic. A real girlfriend would have messaged those people months ago. But you're too selfish. Maybe you just want me to fail. He laughed bitterly. Hey, maybe if my business fails, you can start an OF and support us that way. I walked off feeling hurt that my own boyfriend would even think of selling my body online just because he couldn't have his way with things. I spent the next hour deleting everything. Every post, every review, every message I could still delete. Then I posted a clarification on Facebook. The usual, that wasn't me. Please disregard anything sent last night. Marco saw the post and immediately lost it, posting comments all over calling me ungrateful in public. I spent 30 minutes trying to delete each comment he made until he grew tired and stormed into the room. Are you stupid or something? You're destroying my business. I already lost 1 follower because of you. He grabbed his car keys from the nightstand and slammed the door on the way out. After that, I decided to change all my passwords, enable 2-factor authentication on everything. But no matter what, Marco was spiraling and he didn't plan on stopping. Later that night, my ex-boyfriend Jace called me. We hadn't spoken in 2 years, and hearing the deep concern in his voice immediately made my chest tighten. Hey, are you okay? I'm here for you, you know. You can always vent to me when you need it. Just don't take your own life, he said gently. I froze. Take my own life? What are you even talking about? He sent me screenshots of a conversation he had with me, except it wasn't me. I mean, the pictures, the name, the profile looked exactly like mine, but it clearly wasn't. But the messages the imposter sent to Jace made me want to throw up. Jace, I need your help. I'm in a really dark place. I've been thinking about ending things. The only thing that would help is if you book Marco for car detailing. Please. It's the only thing keeping me going. There's more, Jace said quietly. The next messages were worse. If you don't book within the next hour, I'm going to hurt myself. This is your fault, Jace. You destroyed me when we broke up. The least you can do is help my boyfriend's business. Then, I have pills. I have a plan. Book the appointment or I'll do it. Last chance. I was about to call 911, Jace said, but this wasn't like you at all. Listen, if you need help, call me. I thanked him and quickly hung up. But soon, other exes started calling me concerned over the same thing. Every guy I'd ever dated, hooked up with, or even just matched with on dating apps. Hundreds of messages. Some had already responded, begging me not to hurt myself, saying they'd book appointments immediately. I called Marco, begging him to stop. You told my ex I'd hurt myself if he didn't book a car wash? Are you crazy? Well, did he book? Marco asked casually. Marco, I gasped out at his audacity. It's just marketing. Don't take it so hard. I went to the police station the next morning with everything printed out. The fake profiles, the suicide threats, screenshots from Jace and 12 other men who'd received similar messages. The officer's face went from bored to concerned to angry as she read through them. They showed up at Marco's shop that afternoon while he was with a customer and immediately served him with a cease and desist, informing him he was under investigation for identity theft, criminal harassment, and fraud. Marco called me 23 times in 10 minutes. When I finally answered, he was screaming, "You called the cops? Are you insane? They took my laptop. They're shutting down my Facebook ads." His breathing grew more ragged. "I'm going to lose everything because you're too sensitive to understand business." Then his voice got quiet and mean. "You know what? You're going to regret ruining my life. Maybe those messages about hurting yourself weren't so far off. Maybe you're actually crazy enough to do it. And maybe I'll be around to help you take your life," he threatened. "Lock your windows, baby. I'm coming." I grabbed my phone with hands that wouldn't stop shaking and dialed 911. The dispatcher answered on the second ring, and I tried to keep my voice steady as I explained that my boyfriend just threatened to come help me take my life and told me to lock my windows. She asked for his exact words, and I read them from the text message, my voice cracking on the part about locking windows. The dispatcher told me to stay on the line while she sent officers to my apartment and to Marco's shop and his home address. She asked if I had somewhere safe to go tonight, and I said my mom's house across town. She told me to lock all my doors and windows right now and stay away from any ground floor windows until officers arrived. I put her on speaker and ran around my apartment checking every lock twice, pulling curtains closed, turning on all the lights. The dispatcher kept talking to me the whole time, asking about my relationship with Marco, how long we'd been together, if he'd been violent before. I told her about the identity theft, the fake suicide threats to my exes, the police visit yesterday with the cease and desist. She made notes of everything and told me officers were 8 minutes away. Those 8 minutes felt like hours as I sat on my couch away from the windows, listening to every car that drove past, every sound from the hallway outside my door. When I finally heard the knock and the dispatcher confirmed it was the officers, I felt my whole body go weak with relief. 2 police cars were parked outside and Officer Ramirez came inside while her partner walked around the outside of my building checking the perimeter. She was maybe 40 with her hair pulled back tight and she had this calm but serious way of talking that made me feel like she actually cared. I showed her everything on my phone. The threatening texts from Marco, the voicemails where he was screaming about the cops taking his laptop, all the screenshots I'd printed yesterday for the police report about the identity theft and fake profiles. She read through it all carefully, and her jaw got tight when she saw the part about him coming to help me take my life. She radioed for additional units to check Marco's known locations, and told dispatch this was now a terroristic threat case, not just harassment. I asked if they were really going to find him, and she looked me right in the eye and said they were treating this as an active danger situation. She explained that Marco's threat was specific and direct, which moved this beyond the harassment charges from yesterday into criminal territory. She told me I needed to pack a bag and leave this apartment tonight because he knew exactly where I lived, and she couldn't guarantee my safety here. Her partner came back inside and confirmed the perimeter was clear, but recommended I leave through the back entrance just to be safe. Officer Ramirez stayed with me while I threw clothes and toiletries into a duffel bag, my hands still shaking so bad I could barely zip it closed. She asked where I was planning to go, and I said my mom's house. She said that was good, but asked if Marco knew that address, and I realized I wasn't sure if he'd ever been there or if I'd mentioned it. She told me to call my mom now and explain the situation, so she could be prepared. I called and my mom answered on the first ring, her voice already worried because it was so late. I tried to explain calmly but ended up crying as I told her about Marco's threat and that I needed to come stay with her. Her voice was shaking when she said, of course, come right now, but I could hear the fear underneath. She asked if I was safe and I told her the police were here with me. Officer Ramirez took the phone and spoke to my mom directly, explaining the situation and that she would escort me to the house and make sure I got inside safely. She gave my mom instructions to turn on all outside lights and lock all doors and windows until we arrived. When she handed the phone back, my mom told me to drive carefully and that she loved me. Officer Ramirez walked me down to my car through the back entrance while her partner checked the parking lot. She followed me in her patrol car the whole drive across town, staying right behind me at every turn. My mom was waiting at the front door when we pulled up and the porch light and every downstairs light was blazing. She hugged me so tight I could barely breathe and I felt her whole body trembling against mine. Officer Ramirez came inside and did a quick walkthrough of the house, checking all the doors and windows on the ground floor. She left her card with both of us and made my mom promise to call 911 immediately if anything seemed wrong, if we heard anything outside, if Marco tried to contact either of us. She said they were still looking for Marco and would call as soon as they located him. After she left, my mom triple-checked every lock on every door and window, her hands shaking as she tested each one. We went through the whole house together, and I realized she had no security system at all, no cameras, just basic locks that suddenly felt completely useless against someone who really wanted to get in. We spent the next hour looking up home security systems on her laptop, trying to figure out what we could afford and what could be installed quickly. My mom kept getting up to peek out the curtains even though I told her not to, and every time a car drove down her street we both froze and listened until it passed. Around midnight my phone rang and I jumped so hard I almost dropped it. It was Officer Ramirez calling to tell me they'd located Marco at a bar near his shop. He was drunk and belligerent and they'd arrested him on the terroristic threat charge. He was being held overnight at the county jail pending arraignment in the morning. She said this gave me maybe 24 hours to figure out my next steps, because he'd probably be released on bail tomorrow. I thanked her and hung up, feeling this weird mix of relief that he was in custody, but also terror about what would happen when he got out. My mom made up the guest room, but neither of us could really sleep. I lay in bed jumping at every sound, every creak of the house settling, every distant siren. My mind kept replaying Marco's threat over and over, the way his voice had gone quiet and mean when he said he'd be around to help me take my life. By morning, I was exhausted, but my brain wouldn't shut off. My mom made coffee and we sat at her kitchen table while I started making a list of everything I needed to do. Get a restraining order. Tell my job I needed to work from home. Figure out security for both our places. Change my phone number, maybe. I kept thinking of more things, and the list just grew longer and more overwhelming. My mom suggested calling a lawyer, but I knew I couldn't afford that right now, not with my apartment rent and all my regular bills. She offered to help pay, but she was on a fixed income, and I didn't want to burden her more than I already was by staying here. At 8 in the morning, I called my workplace and asked to speak to someone in HR. They transferred me to Natalia Velasquez, and I explained the situation as calmly as I could, that my ex-boyfriend had threatened me and been arrested, and I needed to work from home for safety reasons. She didn't ask a lot of questions, just said she was sorry this was happening, and that she'd arrange everything with my manager today. She asked if I needed any other help or resources, and I said I didn't know yet. She gave me her direct number and told me to call anytime if my situation changed or if I needed additional support. After I hung up, I felt relieved that at least my job wasn't going to be a problem, but also embarrassed that my personal life was such a disaster. I spent the rest of the morning on my mom's laptop researching restraining orders and protective orders and learning they weren't exactly the same thing. The process looked way more complicated than I expected, with court filings and forms and a hearing where I'd have to explain everything to a judge. My mom suggested calling a lawyer again, and I looked up legal aid services in our area. Most of them had waiting lists or income requirements, and I wasn't sure if I qualified. I found a domestic violence legal clinic that offered free help with protective orders, and I bookmarked their website to call when they opened. Officer Ramirez called back around 11 to tell me Marco had been arraigned that morning and released on bail. My stomach dropped when she said released because I'd been hoping he'd stay locked up longer. She explained he had conditions to stay away from me and not contact me, but she strongly recommended I file for a protective order anyway. I asked why if he already had bail conditions, and she said those were just temporary until his court date, and they were hard to enforce. A protective order would be longer term and would give me more legal protection if he violated it. She said the bail conditions could change or be lifted, but a protective order would stay in place regardless of what happened with the criminal case. I thanked her and wrote down the name of the courthouse where I needed to file. After we hung up, I just sat there feeling scared and tired and overwhelmed by how much I still had to do to feel safe again. I opened my mom's laptop and typed "Free Legal Help Protective Order" into the search bar, scrolling past lawyer ads until I found the county's domestic violence legal clinic website. They opened at 9, so I watched the clock until exactly 9:01 and dialed the number with my hands shaking slightly. A woman answered on the second ring and asked what I needed help with, and I explained as calmly as I could that my ex-boyfriend threatened me, and the police said I should file for a protective order. She asked if I was in immediate danger right now, and I said no. He was arrested yesterday but released this morning on bail. She typed something and then told me they had an opening at 2 this afternoon if I could come in, and I said yes immediately, writing down the address on a piece of paper. She asked a few basic questions about the threats and harassment, and I gave her the short version about the fake profiles and the direct threat to help me take my life. Her voice stayed calm and professional through the whole conversation, which somehow made me feel slightly less like I was losing my mind. When I hung up, I felt like I could breathe a little better, knowing I had an actual appointment with someone who could help. At 1:45, my mom drove me to the legal clinic in a strip mall near the courthouse, and we walked into a small waiting room with worn chairs and posters about domestic violence resources on the walls. A woman about my age came out and introduced herself as Faye Collier, a victim advocate who would help me with the protective order paperwork. She led me back to a tiny office with a desk covered in folders and asked my mom if she wanted to stay or wait outside, and my mom squeezed my hand before going back to the waiting room. Faye pulled up a form on her computer and started asking questions, beginning with basic information like my name and address, and Marco's full name and where he lived. Then she asked me to describe every incident of harassment and threats in detail, starting from the beginning with the fake messages he sent from my accounts. I walked her through the book club spam, the fake 5-star reviews, the messages to my exes pretending to be me, and she typed everything into the court form while I talked. She asked specific questions about dates and times, about exactly what the fake suicide threats said, about how many people received messages, and I pulled out my phone to show her screenshots. When I got to the part about Marco's final threat, telling me he'd help me take my life and to lock my windows, my voice started shaking and I had to stop for a second. Faye handed me a tissue box and waited patiently while I pulled myself together, then asked me to repeat his exact words so she could type them into the form. We spent 2 hours going through everything, and by the end I felt exhausted, but also relieved that someone was taking this seriously and documenting it all properly. Faye printed out the completed forms and had me sign them, then explained that I needed to go to the courthouse tomorrow morning for an emergency hearing. A judge would review my petition and decide whether to grant a temporary protective order, and if the judge agreed, Marco would be served with the order by the sheriff's office. Then there would be another hearing in about 2 weeks where Marco could show up and contest the order, and the judge would decide whether to extend it long term. I asked what happens if the judge doesn't grant it tomorrow, and Faye said that was unlikely given the direct threat Marco made, but if it happened, I could refile with more evidence. She told me to be at the courthouse by 8:30 tomorrow morning, and to bring my phone with all the screenshots in case the judge wanted to see them. That evening, my mom and I drove to the big hardware store on the highway and spent almost an hour walking through the aisles looking at security equipment. We picked out window alarms that would sound if someone tried to open a window, motion sensor lights for the front and back doors, and a video doorbell camera that connected to a phone app. The total came to almost $300, and my mom insisted on paying even though I tried to split it with her. Back at her house, we spent the next 3 hours installing everything, and I was grateful for the physical activity because it gave me something to focus on besides my anxiety. I drilled holes for the window sensors while my mom read the instructions out loud, and we tested each one to make sure the alarm actually worked. The motion lights were easier, just screwing them into the existing porch light fixtures and adjusting the sensitivity. The doorbell camera was the most complicated, requiring us to download an app and connect it to the Wi-Fi, but finally we got it working and could see the front porch on my mom's phone screen. By the time we finished, it was almost 9 at night and we were both exhausted, but the house felt more secure with all the new equipment. I sat on the couch and pulled out my phone to check my messages, and that's when I saw I had 15 notifications on Facebook. I opened the app and immediately felt sick when I saw Marco had posted a long rant on his business page. He wrote that I was a crazy ex-girlfriend who made up lies to get him arrested and ruin his business, that the police found nothing wrong and released him, and that I was vindictive and mentally unstable. The post had already gotten 30 comments, including several from mutual acquaintances asking what was really going on and whether they should be concerned. Someone wrote that they always thought I seemed nice and this was shocking, and another person said there are two sides to every story. I wanted to respond and defend myself, but I knew that would just make things worse and turn our private nightmare into even more public drama. My phone buzzed with a text from Jace asking if I was okay and saying he saw Marco's post. I stared at the message for a minute, feeling weird that my ex-boyfriend was checking on me during my current relationship disaster, but also grateful that someone believed me and cared enough to reach out. I texted back a brief thanks and said I was handling it, trying to keep boundaries even though part of me wanted to vent everything to someone who would understand. He replied that he was here if I needed anything, and I just sent back a thumbs up emoji before putting my phone away. The next morning, I barely slept, getting up at 6 to shower and try to make myself look presentable for court. My mom drove me to the courthouse and we found parking in the crowded lot, then walked through security and found the protective order office on the second floor. Faye was already waiting in the hallway, and she led me to a room full of people sitting in plastic chairs, some with advocates like Faye, and some alone. Everyone looked exhausted and scared, some with papers clutched in their hands and some just staring at the floor. I realized this was just a regular Tuesday for the court system, that they handled these cases constantly, and this room was probably full every single day. We sat down and Faye reviewed my paperwork one more time, reminding me to speak clearly and stick to the facts when the judge asked questions. At 9:15, a clerk came out and started calling names and people went through a door one by one, some coming back out 10 minutes later looking relieved or upset. Finally, the clerk called my name and Faye walked with me into a small courtroom where a judge sat behind a tall desk. The clerk directed me to stand at a podium with a microphone, and the judge looked at me over her reading glasses and asked me to state my name and why I was seeking a protective order. My voice shook as I started explaining about Marco using my accounts to send fake messages, about the suicide threats he sent to my exes trying to force them to book his services, and finally about his direct threat that he would help me take my life and told me to lock my windows. The judge listened with a serious expression, occasionally looking down at the paperwork in front of her, and when I finished, she asked if I had evidence of these threats. I pulled out my phone and showed her the screenshots, and she leaned forward to look at them carefully. She asked a few questions about when the threats occurred and whether Marco had contacted me since his arrest, and I explained that he posted about me on social media last night calling me crazy and vindictive. The judge nodded and made some notes, then said that based on the evidence I presented, she was granting a temporary protective order effective immediately. She explained that the order prohibited Marco from contacting me directly or indirectly, coming within 500 feet of me or my mom's house, and posting about me on social media. The threat he made was specific and credible enough to warrant protection, she said, and the order would remain in effect pending a hearing in 2 weeks where Marco could contest it if he chose. I felt my shoulders relax slightly hearing those words, and I thanked the judge before walking back out to the hallway where my mom was waiting. Faye met us outside the courtroom and explained that now the sheriff's office had to serve Marco with the order, which might take a few days depending on when they could locate him. Until he was officially served with the paperwork, the order wasn't technically enforceable, which meant if he showed up at my mom's house right now, the police couldn't arrest him just for violating the order. That gap in protection scared me, but Faye said the sheriff's office usually served these orders within 48 hours, and I should call them this afternoon to check on the status. She reminded me to document any contact Marco made, and to call the police immediately if he violated the order once it was served. I walked out of the courthouse with the signed order in my hand, feeling like I'd accomplished something important, but also knowing this was just the beginning of a long process. Back at my mom's house, I set up my laptop at her dining room table and opened my work email for the first time in 3 days. There were 47 unread messages, and I stared at them feeling completely overwhelmed. I clicked on the first one, something about a client deliverable due next week, and read the same sentence 4 times without understanding what it said. My brain kept jumping to Marco, to the protective order sitting in my bag, to whether the sheriff had found him yet to serve the papers. I forced myself to respond to 3 emails before my phone rang, and I saw it was Natalia from HR. She asked how I was holding up and whether I had everything I needed to work remotely, and I told her I was managing even though I felt like I was failing at my job. She said the company understood I was dealing with a difficult situation, and not to worry about productivity right now, just focus on staying safe and doing what I could. After we hung up, I felt grateful, but also guilty, like I was letting everyone down by not being able to concentrate on spreadsheets when my life was falling apart. I spent the rest of the afternoon pretending to work while actually refreshing my email every 5 minutes to see if the sheriff's office had contacted me about serving Marco. 2 days went by with no word about whether Marco had been served with the protective order, and the waiting made me feel like I was losing my mind. Every time a car drove down my mom's street, I jumped up and looked out the window to make sure it wasn't his truck. I started recognizing the neighbors' vehicles, the mail carrier's schedule, the delivery drivers who came regularly, and anything unfamiliar sent my heart racing. My mom noticed me pacing and checking the locks constantly, and she started doing it too, both of us trapped in this anxious routine. At night, I lay awake listening to every sound outside, convinced I heard footsteps or car doors closing, and I'd get up to peek through the curtains at the empty street. I was getting maybe 3 or 4 hours of sleep each night, and I could feel it affecting everything from my work performance to my ability to think clearly. On the 3rd morning, I called the sheriff's office to ask about the status of serving the order, and they said they were still trying to locate Marco at his business address. The uncertainty was almost worse than knowing he'd been served, because until that happened, the protective order meant nothing, and he could show up anywhere without consequences. My phone rang while I was staring blankly at a spreadsheet, and an unfamiliar number appeared on the screen. I answered cautiously, and a woman introduced herself as Detective Torres from the police department, saying she'd been assigned to investigate the identity theft and harassment case. Her voice was calm and professional, and she explained that she wanted to meet with me to go through all the evidence in detail so she could build the strongest possible case. I felt a surge of relief that someone was actually taking this seriously and working on it, not just filing it away as another report. We scheduled a meeting for tomorrow afternoon at the police station, and she told me to bring my laptop, phone, and any other devices Marco might have accessed, along with printed copies of everything if I had them. After hanging up, I spent the rest of the day organizing all my screenshots into folders by category, fake profiles in one, messages to exes in another, business reviews and posts in a third. I wanted to make sure Detective Torres had everything she needed to see the full scope of what Marco had done. That night, my mom and I were sitting in the living room with all the curtains closed when she suddenly said she was scared having me stay here. Her voice shook a little as she asked what would happen if Marco figured out where she lived and came here looking for me. I felt terrible hearing the fear in her voice, knowing I'd brought this danger to her doorstep just by being her daughter. I apologized and said I could try to find somewhere else to stay, maybe a hotel or something, but she immediately backtracked and said no. She wanted me here where she could keep an eye on me. We talked through our safety plan again, confirming that all the windows had the new alarms, the motion lights were working, and we both had the police non-emergency number saved in our phones. She made me promise that if anything felt wrong or if I saw Marco anywhere near the house, I'd call the police immediately without hesitation. I promised, and we sat there in silence for a while, both of us hyper-aware of every sound outside. I hated that Marco had made my mom afraid in her own home, that his threats had spread this fear beyond just me to the people I loved. The next afternoon, I drove to the police station with my laptop bag full of evidence and my stomach tight with nerves. Detective Torres met me in a small interview room, and she was probably in her 40s with short dark hair and a no-nonsense expression that made me feel like she'd seen everything before. I set up my laptop on the table between us and started showing her everything, beginning with the fake profiles Marco had created using my photos and information. She leaned forward to look at the screen, asking questions about when I first discovered them and how I knew it was him. I showed her the messages he'd sent to Jace and my other exes, the fake suicide threats, the attempts to force them to book his car detailing services. She took photos of each screen with her phone, zooming in on specific details, and I could see her expression getting more serious as she went through everything. When I showed her the business reviews and the posts he'd made on my Facebook, she asked if I had screenshots of the comments he'd left calling me ungrateful and crazy. I did, and I showed her those too, along with the timeline of when everything happened. She explained that she was creating a comprehensive case file, and this was going to take time to build properly for prosecution, but she wanted me to know she was treating this as a serious criminal matter. Detective Torres said the impersonation and fake suicide threats could qualify as identity theft and criminal harassment under state law, and possibly even extortion, since Marco was trying to force people to pay money for his services through threats and manipulation. She was also coordinating with Officer Ramirez about the terroristic threat charge from when he told me he'd help me take my life, and together they were trying to build a comprehensive case that showed the full pattern of his behavior. I felt relieved hearing her lay out all the potential charges because it validated that what happened to me wasn't just a bad breakup or relationship drama, it was actual criminal activity. She asked if I'd noticed any other suspicious activity on my accounts, or if Marco had tried to contact me since his arrest, and I told her about changing all my passwords and enabling two-factor authentication. She said that was smart, and I should keep monitoring everything closely, because people like Marco often escalate their behavior when they feel they're losing control. The way she said it made me nervous because it implied he might try something else, but at least I knew she understood the situation and was taking it seriously. I asked Detective Torres how long this investigation was going to take, because I needed to know when I could stop living in constant fear and move forward with my life. She was quiet for a moment, then said honestly that it could be weeks or even months to gather all the digital evidence and get subpoenas for the social media platforms. My heart dropped hearing that timeline because I'd been hoping for something faster, maybe a few weeks at most. But she explained that building a solid case against someone for digital crimes takes time. They had to formally request records from Facebook, Instagram, email providers, and potentially phone companies, and each of those requests required legal paperwork and processing time. Then they had to analyze all that data to prove Marco was the one behind the fake accounts and messages, which meant comparing IP addresses, device information, and timing patterns. She could see my disappointment, and she said she understood I wanted this resolved quickly, but rushing the investigation could mean missing evidence or building a weak case that might not hold up in court. I nodded and said I understood, but inside I felt exhausted at the thought of months more of this hanging over me. 3 days after my meeting with Detective Torres, my phone rang, and it was the sheriff's office calling to confirm they'd finally served Marco with the protective order. They'd gone to his car detailing shop that morning and found him there with a customer, and they'd handed him the paperwork right there in front of everyone. The deputy on the phone said Marco had gotten angry and tried to argue, but they'd explained that the order was now officially in effect, and any violations would result in immediate arrest. Hearing those words made me breathe a little easier because it meant the protective order was finally enforceable, not just a piece of paper sitting in my bag. If Marco tried to contact me now, if he came anywhere near me or my mom's house, if he posted about me on social media, the police could arrest him right away without having to build a new case or file new charges. I thanked the deputy and hung up, then immediately texted Faye to let her know the order had been served. She replied congratulating me and reminding me to document any violations immediately, because time-stamped evidence was crucial if we needed to go back to court. 2 days later, I was working at my mom's dining room table when my phone buzzed with a notification from my email provider saying someone had tried to log into my account from an unfamiliar location. My hands started shaking as I opened the security alert and saw it had happened about an hour ago from an IP address I didn't recognize. The login attempt had been blocked by my two-factor authentication, which meant whoever tried to get in couldn't access my account. But it freaked me out knowing Marco was still trying. I checked my other accounts and saw similar failed login attempts on my Instagram and Facebook from around the same time, all blocked by the security measures I'd put in place. Part of me felt grateful I'd enabled all that protection, but another part felt violated knowing he was still actively trying to access my private information, even after being served with a protective order that specifically prohibited any contact with me. I took screenshots of all the security alerts with the timestamps and IP addresses clearly visible, knowing I needed to report this to Detective Torres right away. I called Detective Torres and left a message explaining about the login attempts, then emailed her the screenshots so she'd have them in writing. She called me back within an hour and said she was adding this to the case file as a possible protective order violation, since attempting to access my accounts could be considered indirect contact. She explained that they'd need to confirm the IP address traced back to Marco's location or devices, but if it did, this would be another piece of evidence showing his continued pattern of harassment. She reminded me to keep documenting everything with screenshots and timestamps, because every single piece of evidence mattered when building a case like this. I asked if this was enough to get him arrested for violating the order, and she said probably not on its own since they'd have to prove it was actually him and not someone else. But combined with everything else, it strengthened the overall case. After we hung up, I went through all my accounts again and changed every password to something completely random that Marco could never guess, and I enabled every security feature available. I felt like I was living in a constant state of defense, always waiting for his next move and trying to stay one step ahead. The next morning, my manager called while I was trying to focus on a spreadsheet at my mom's dining room table. She asked how the work-from-home setup was going, and if I had everything I needed, and I told her it was fine, and I appreciated the flexibility. Then she mentioned they had an important client meeting scheduled for next week, and they really needed me there in person, because the client specifically requested to meet the whole team. My stomach dropped, and I felt my hands start to shake because Marco knew exactly where I worked and what time I usually arrived. I asked if there was any way I could join virtually instead, maybe through video conference, and I could hear the hesitation in her voice. She said she'd have to check with the client, but it might not look professional to have one team member remote when everyone else was there. After we hung up, I sat staring at my laptop screen feeling panicked about the thought of being at my regular office building where Marco could easily find me. I called Natalia from HR and explained the situation, reminding her about the protective order and Marco's threats, and she immediately understood. She told me she'd handle it and coordinate with my manager to make sure I could participate remotely, and that my safety took priority over any client preferences. Within 2 hours, Natalia called back to confirm she'd arranged for me to join the client meeting via video conference, and had explained to my manager that my current situation required workplace flexibility. I felt relieved but also embarrassed that my personal crisis was affecting my professional reputation, and making me seem difficult or high maintenance. I thanked Natalia and tried to get back to work, but I kept thinking about how Marco was still controlling my life even from a distance. That afternoon, I decided to look at my bank account and figure out my financial situation, because I'd been avoiding it for days. I opened my banking app and started going through my expenses from the past few weeks, and the numbers made me feel sick. Between taking time off work and reduced productivity, I'd lost almost a full week's pay. Then there were the costs I hadn't really added up before, like the security equipment for my mom's house that cost over $300, and the legal consultation fees that added another $200 even though the clinic was supposed to be free for the basic protective order help. I still had my apartment lease and rent was due in 5 days, but I hadn't been back there since the night Marco threatened me, and I was too scared to stay there alone. I was paying over $1,000 a month for a place I couldn't even live in, and that realization made me want to cry. I pulled up a calculator and tried to figure out if I could make next month's rent with my reduced income and all these new expenses, and the math didn't work. I sat there staring at the numbers and feeling like Marco had managed to destroy not just my sense of safety, but my financial stability too. My mom came in and found me looking stressed at the dining room table with my laptop open to my bank statements. She asked what was wrong, and I explained that I was going to struggle to make rent on my apartment and I didn't know what to do. She sat down next to me and suggested I could stay with her longer term, maybe even sublet my apartment to someone else so I wouldn't lose money every month on a place I wasn't using. Part of me knew that made sense financially, but another part of me hated the idea because it felt like I was running away and letting Marco control my life. I told her I didn't want to give up my apartment because that felt like admitting he'd won and driven me out of my own home. She pointed out that I wasn't staying there anyway, and it was just costing me money I didn't have, and staying somewhere safe wasn't the same as letting him win. I knew she was right, but it still made me angry that I had to make this choice at all. At the same time, I understood that going back to my apartment alone right now would be stupid and dangerous, especially since Marco knew exactly where I lived and had already threatened to come there. We talked through the options for almost an hour, and I finally agreed to start looking into subletting, even though the whole thing made me feel defeated. 3 days later, Faye from the legal clinic called to remind me about the protective order hearing that was scheduled in 10 days. She explained what to expect at the hearing, telling me that Marco had the right to contest the temporary order, and he might bring a lawyer to argue that I was exaggerating or lying about everything. She said I needed to be prepared to tell my whole story again in front of the judge, showing all the evidence and explaining why I needed the order to be made permanent for a full year. The thought of facing Marco in court made my chest tight and my breathing shallow, but Faye walked me through the process step by step. She told me the hearing would probably take about 2 hours, and I'd testify first. Then Marco or his lawyer could question me. Then he'd have a chance to present his side. She reminded me to bring all my printed evidence and my phone with the original screenshots, and to stay calm and factual when answering questions. She also warned me that Marco's lawyer might try to make me seem emotional or unstable, or like I was making false accusations to hurt his business. I asked her what I should do if that happened, and she said just stick to the facts and don't get defensive. Let the evidence speak for itself. After we hung up, I felt more anxious than before, but at least I knew what was coming. I spent the next week trying to maintain some kind of normalcy while working from my mom's dining room table and joining video calls with my coworkers. On camera, I smiled and acted like everything was fine, participating in meetings and giving project updates like I wasn't dealing with a stalking situation and court hearings. My coworkers didn't know the details of why I was working remotely, and I wanted to keep it that way to avoid becoming the subject of workplace gossip. A few people asked casually when I'd be back in the office, and I gave vague answers about having some personal stuff to deal with and needing flexibility for a while. It was exhausting pretending to be normal when my life felt like it was falling apart, but I didn't want my career to suffer any more than it already had. Every day I forced myself to log in on time, attend all my meetings, and complete my work assignments even though I could barely focus. At night, I'd collapse into bed at my mom's house feeling drained from the effort of keeping up appearances. Detective Torres called during my lunch break with an update about the investigation. She told me she'd been working with the tech team to trace the IP addresses used to create the fake profiles that sent messages to all my exes. She explained that they'd identified the IP address for several of the fake accounts, and it traced back to Marco's car detailing shop location. I felt a rush of satisfaction knowing there was actual proof connecting him to the harassment, but Detective Torres cautioned me that it wasn't definitive evidence he personally created the accounts. She said it just showed the accounts were created from his business location, which could theoretically have been someone else using his internet connection, but it was strong circumstantial evidence that supported the overall case. She told me she was documenting everything carefully and building a comprehensive file that showed a clear pattern of harassment and identity theft. The district attorney's office was reviewing the evidence to decide what criminal charges to file, and she expected they'd make a decision within the next few weeks. I thanked her for the update and asked if this information would help at my protective order hearing, and she said she'd make sure the prosecutor knew about it so they could mention it to the judge if needed. 3 days before the protective order hearing, I got an email notification from the court saying Marco's lawyer had filed a response to my petition. I opened the attachment with shaking hands and started reading his version of events. The letter claimed I was making false allegations to harm Marco's business reputation, and that I'd deliberately misinterpreted his messages to make them sound threatening. It said I was a vindictive ex-girlfriend who couldn't accept that the relationship was over, and I was using the legal system to harass him. Reading his twisted version of what happened made me so angry I was physically shaking, and I had to put my phone down and walk away for a minute. Everything he wrote was either a complete lie or a manipulation of what actually happened. He claimed the messages to my exes were just creative marketing, and I'd overreacted because I was jealous of his business success. He said his text about helping me take my life was taken out of context, and he was just responding sarcastically to my threats to call the police on him. I called Faye immediately and read her parts of the letter, my voice shaking with anger. She listened calmly, and then told me this was completely typical defense strategy, that Marco's lawyer was doing exactly what she'd warned me about. She reminded me that I had screenshots and evidence and witness statements from people like Jace who received the fake messages, and the judge would see through Marco's lies. Faye scheduled a time for me to come to the legal clinic so she could help me prepare for the hearing. We spent almost 3 hours going through practice questions, with her playing the role of Marco's lawyer and asking me aggressive questions designed to make me defensive. She made me tell the story over and over again, starting from when I first discovered the fake messages and going through every incident up to Marco's direct threat. The first few times I got through it, I started crying when I talked about the suicide threats he sent to my exes, but Faye told me I needed to get through the whole story without breaking down. She explained that the judge needed to see me as credible and calm, not emotional and vindictive like Marco's lawyer would try to portray me. We practiced answers to questions like why I didn't just block Marco earlier, and why I didn't leave the relationship sooner if things were so bad, and whether I'd ever threatened him or done anything to provoke his behavior. Faye taught me to answer every question with specific facts and evidence, referring back to screenshots and dates and exact quotes from messages. By the end of the session, I felt more prepared but also completely drained from reliving everything multiple times. The night before the hearing, I barely slept, lying in my mom's guest bed and running through everything in my head. I kept worrying about facing Marco in the courtroom and what he might say or do, and whether the judge would believe me or think I was exaggerating. Every time I started to drift off, I'd jolt awake thinking about a question I might not be able to answer, or evidence I might have forgotten to print. Around 2 in the morning, I gave up on sleeping and went downstairs to find my mom sitting at the kitchen table. She said she couldn't sleep either because she was worried about me, and she put the kettle on to make us both tea. We sat together in the quiet kitchen drinking chamomile tea, and she reminded me that I had evidence and truth on my side. She told me she was proud of how strong I'd been through this whole nightmare, and that no matter what happened tomorrow, I'd done everything right. I leaned my head on her shoulder and felt grateful that at least I had her support, even though I wished none of this was happening at all. The morning of the hearing, my mom drove me to the courthouse and we met Faye in the parking lot. My hands wouldn't stop shaking as we walked through security and up to the courtroom on the 3rd floor. Faye stayed close beside me, carrying a folder with all my evidence organized and ready. We sat on a bench outside the courtroom waiting for our case to be called, and that's when I saw him. Marco was sitting across the hall with a man in a suit who must have been his lawyer. He looked calm, almost relaxed, like this was just another Tuesday for him. His lawyer was talking to him quietly, and Marco nodded along, and seeing him act so normal made my stomach drop hard. I felt like I might actually throw up right there in the courthouse hallway. Faye must have noticed because she put her hand on my arm and leaned close. She reminded me to breathe, to focus on what I came here to do. I tried to take slow breaths, but my chest felt tight and my heart was pounding, so loud I thought everyone could hear it. Marco glanced over at me once and our eyes met for just a second before I looked away. That one look made me feel cold all over. The bailiff finally called my case and we all filed into the courtroom. The judge was already sitting at the bench, a woman probably in her 50s with gray hair pulled back. I sat at a table with Faye while Marco and his lawyer sat at another table on the opposite side. The hearing took almost 2 hours, and it felt like the longest 2 hours of my entire life. I had to testify first, standing at a podium and swearing to tell the truth with my hand on a Bible. The judge asked me to explain why I needed a protective order, and I started from the beginning. I told her about waking up to the fake messages, about Marco using my accounts without permission, about the fake profiles he created. I explained how he sent suicide threats to my exes pretending to be me, trying to force them to book his car detailing services. My voice shook when I got to the part about his final text message, the one where he said he'd help me take my life and told me to lock my windows. I pulled out my phone and showed the judge the screenshots, scrolling through message after message while she leaned forward to look at the screen. Then Marco's lawyer got to cross-examine me, and that part was awful. He asked me questions designed to make me sound crazy or vindictive. He asked why I didn't just block Marco earlier if I was so scared. He asked if we'd had arguments before, and if I'd ever done anything to upset Marco or hurt his business. He kept using phrases like normal relationship conflict and misunderstanding between partners, like what Marco did was just regular couple drama. He asked if I'd posted the Facebook clarification specifically to damage Marco's business reputation. He asked if I'd gone to the police as revenge for Marco criticizing my level of support for his company. I tried to stay calm and stick to the facts like Faye taught me. I answered every question by referring back to specific evidence, specific dates, exact quotes from the messages Marco sent. When the lawyer suggested I was overreacting, I pulled up the screenshot of the text where Marco threatened to help me take my life and asked if that seemed like an overreaction to be scared of that. After I finished testifying, Marco had to take the stand. He sat in the witness chair looking serious and a little sad, like he was the victim here. He testified that he never threatened me at all. He claimed I misunderstood his texts and took them out of context. He said he was just frustrated about his business struggles, and I blew everything out of proportion. His lawyer asked him about the fake profiles, and Marco said he was just trying to market his business, and I'd refused to help him even though I was his girlfriend. He made it sound like creating fake accounts in my name was a reasonable business strategy that I should have supported. His lawyer argued that the protective order was unnecessary and would actually harm Marco's livelihood because it restricted his ability to use social media for his business. The lawyer said Marco needed social media to advertise and connect with customers, and the order would basically destroy his company. He painted me as someone trying to ruin Marco's life over a simple misunderstanding. The judge stayed quiet through most of the testimony, but I could see her taking notes. When Marco's lawyer finished, the judge looked directly at Marco and asked him to explain the text message, where he said he would help me take my life, and told me to lock my windows. The courtroom got very quiet. Marco shifted in his chair and said it was taken out of context. He claimed he was being sarcastic and didn't mean it literally. He said he was just venting his frustration, and I should have known he wasn't serious. The judge's expression changed when he said that. Her eyebrows went up slightly and she looked down at her notes for a long moment. She asked Marco if he understood how someone might interpret a message like that as a genuine threat. Marco said he guessed so, but insisted he never meant it that way. The judge asked if he thought it was appropriate to send a message like that even as sarcasm. Marco hesitated and then said probably not. Watching the judge's face, I felt a small spark of hope that maybe she actually saw through his excuses. After hearing all the testimony, the judge took about 5 minutes to review her notes. Then she looked up and said she was extending the protective order for 1 year. She said Marco's threats were credible, and his pattern of harassment was well documented in the evidence I provided. She listed out the terms of the order, that Marco couldn't contact me directly or indirectly, couldn't come within 500 feet of me or my mom's house, couldn't post about me on social media, and couldn't access any of my accounts or create fake profiles in my name. Then she looked straight at Marco and warned him that any violation of the order would result in immediate arrest and criminal contempt charges. She said she was taking this seriously because his behavior showed a concerning escalation, and she wanted to make sure I was protected. Her voice was firm when she said it, and Marco just sat there staring at the table in front of him. Walking out of the courthouse with the signed protective order in my hand felt like a huge victory. My legs were shaky from the adrenaline wearing off, but I also felt lighter somehow, like a weight had lifted. Faye walked out with me and my mom, and in the parking lot she reminded me that the order was only as good as enforcement. She explained that I needed to call the police immediately if Marco violated it in any way, even something small like a text message or social media post. She said I should continue documenting everything just in case, keeping records of any attempted contact or suspicious activity. She also reminded me that Marco might try to find ways around the order, like having friends contact me on his behalf or creating new fake accounts. I needed to stay alert and report anything that felt like it might be him. I thanked Faye for everything she'd done to help me, and she gave me her card again, telling me to call anytime if I needed support or had questions. That evening, back at my mom's house, I finally started to feel like maybe I could breathe a little. Maybe the worst was over. My mom ordered Chinese takeout to celebrate, and we sat on her couch eating lo mein and spring rolls. She put on a comedy movie, something light and silly that didn't require much thinking. For a few hours, I almost felt normal again. I laughed at the jokes and didn't think about Marco or protective orders or court hearings. My mom kept glancing over at me with this relieved smile, like she was happy to see me relaxing. We stayed up late watching 2 movies back to back, and I fell asleep on the couch around midnight. It was the first decent sleep I'd gotten in weeks. 2 weeks later, I was working at my mom's dining room table when Detective Torres called. She said she had important news about the case. The district attorney's office was filing criminal charges against Marco for identity theft, criminal harassment, and making terroristic threats. My hand froze on my laptop keyboard as she explained what this meant. There would be an arraignment soon where Marco would have to appear in court and enter a plea. If he pleaded not guilty, the case would move toward trial, and I might have to testify again. Detective Torres said the DA felt they had strong evidence for all 3 charges based on the fake profiles, the messages to my exes, and his direct threat. She walked me through the timeline, explaining that the arraignment would probably happen within a few weeks, and then there would be pre-trial hearings and motions before any actual trial. The news that there would be actual criminal charges made everything feel more real and more serious. Part of me was relieved that the system was taking this seriously, that Marco would face real consequences for what he did. But another part of me was exhausted at the thought of more court appearances and having to relive all of this again. I'd just finished one hearing, and now there was a whole criminal case ahead. Detective Torres must have heard something in my voice because she said she understood this was a lot to process. She reminded me that criminal cases often take months or even over a year to resolve completely. She said I should focus on staying safe and moving forward with my life while the legal system did its work. I thanked her for the update and sat at the dining room table for a long time after we hung up, staring at my laptop screen without really seeing it. A few days later, I got a call from the assistant district attorney assigned to the case. She wanted to meet with me to go over everything in detail and prepare me for what was coming. I drove to the DA's office downtown and met with her in a small conference room. She was probably in her late 30s, professional and thorough, with a folder full of documents about Marco's case. She explained each charge and what the prosecution would need to prove. For the identity theft charge, they had to show Marco knowingly used my personal information to impersonate me online. For the criminal harassment charge, they had to prove a pattern of behavior intended to frighten or intimidate me. For the terroristic threats charge, they had to show he made a specific threat that caused me reasonable fear for my safety. She walked through the evidence they had for each charge, the fake profiles, the messages, the screenshots, the testimony from Jace and other exes who received the fake suicide threats. Then she warned me that criminal cases can take months or even over a year to resolve. There would be multiple court dates, possible plea negotiations, and if it went to trial, I'd have to testify again in front of a jury. She asked if I was prepared for that timeline, and I said I didn't really have a choice. She nodded and said she'd keep me updated on every step of the process. A week later, I got the notice in my email that my apartment lease was up for renewal in 30 days, and I needed to decide whether to sign for another year. I stared at the email for a long time, doing the math in my head about rent I'd been paying for a place I hadn't slept in since the night Marco threatened me. My mom found me at the dining room table with a calculator and a bunch of bills spread out, and she sat down across from me without saying anything at first. I showed her the lease renewal notice and told her I was thinking about giving notice and officially moving in with her, at least for a while until I felt safe enough to live alone again. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand, saying she'd been hoping I would stay because having me here made her feel less worried about me being alone somewhere Marco could find me. We talked through the finances and agreed it made the most sense, even though part of me hated admitting that Marco had succeeded in driving me out of my own home. I sent the email to my landlord that afternoon giving my 30-day notice, and it felt like closing a door on the life I'd had before all this started. The following weekend, my mom came with me to pack up my apartment, and walking through the door felt strange after being away for over a month. Everything looked exactly how I'd left it. That night, I ran out with Officer Ramirez following behind me, my coffee mug still on the counter and my laptop charger plugged into the wall. We started in the bedroom, pulling clothes out of the closet and folding them into boxes, and my mom kept trying to make conversation to fill the silence, but I could barely respond. I found a shirt of Marco's shoved in the back of my drawer, and I just threw it straight in the trash, not wanting any reminder of him in my new life. The whole process took most of the day, carrying boxes down to my mom's car and making multiple trips back and forth. My apartment super saw us loading up and asked if everything was okay, and I just said I was moving in with family for a while without explaining why. By evening, we had everything important packed and loaded, and I did one final walk through the empty apartment before turning in my keys. It felt like admitting defeat, but it also felt practical because paying rent on a place I was too scared to live in didn't make any sense. That Monday, I had a video call scheduled with Natalia from HR to discuss my work situation long-term. I'd been working from my mom's house for weeks now with the understanding it was temporary, but I needed to know if I could keep doing it, or if I'd eventually have to go back to the office where Marco knew I worked. Natalia appeared on screen looking professional and kind, and she asked how I was holding up before getting into the business part of the conversation. I explained that I still didn't feel safe going back to the office regularly because of the protective order situation and the ongoing criminal case, and I asked if there was any way to make the remote work arrangement permanent. She said she'd already talked to my manager, and they were willing to approve long-term work from home with quarterly visits to the office for essential meetings only. The relief I felt hearing that was huge because it meant I could keep my job and my income without putting myself in danger. She asked if I needed any other accommodations, or if there were any other ways the company could support me, and I thanked her for being so understanding, even though I knew some of my coworkers probably thought I was getting special treatment. 2 weeks after that conversation, Detective Torres called to tell me Marco's arraignment was scheduled for the next morning and asked if I wanted to attend. I said yes because I wanted to see him face the charges in person, even though the thought of being in the same room with him made my stomach hurt. The courthouse was busy when I arrived, and Detective Torres met me outside the courtroom to walk me through what would happen. She explained that arraignments are usually quick and procedural, just the defendant entering a plea and the judge setting conditions for release or trial. When they brought Marco in wearing regular clothes with his lawyer beside him, my hands started shaking and I had to grip the edge of the bench to steady myself. The judge read the charges out loud: identity theft, criminal harassment, and making terroristic threats, and asked how he pleaded. Marco's lawyer stood up and said not guilty to all charges in a confident voice that made me want to scream. The assistant DA I'd met with before stood up and argued that Marco should have strict bail conditions given the nature of the threats, and the judge agreed to keep the no-contact order in place and add electronic monitoring. The whole thing took maybe 15 minutes and then it was over and Marco was walking out with his lawyer while I sat frozen in my seat. Detective Torres sat with me until I could stand up, and she reminded me that pleading not guilty was expected, and that most defendants do it initially before changing to a plea deal later, as the evidence piles up against them. After the arraignment, I realized I needed professional help dealing with the constant anxiety that had taken over my life. I called my insurance company and got a list of therapists in my network, then spent an hour reading reviews and checking availability before picking one who specialized in trauma. Her first available appointment was 3 days later, and when I showed up to her office, I felt nervous about talking to a stranger about everything that had happened. She was probably in her 50s with a calm way of speaking that immediately put me at ease, and she started by asking me to tell her why I'd come in. I explained the whole situation with Marco, the impersonation and threats and court cases, and how I couldn't sleep and jumped at every sound and felt like I was losing my mind. She listened without interrupting, and then told me that what I was experiencing was a completely normal trauma response to a serious threat, not me going crazy like I'd feared. She taught me some breathing exercises for when I started to panic, and explained how hypervigilance works, and why my body was stuck in fight or flight mode. By the end of the session, I felt like maybe I could learn to manage this instead of just suffering through it, and I scheduled weekly appointments going forward. A few days after my first therapy session, Faye called me from the legal clinic where she'd helped me with the protective order. She asked how I was doing, and then told me about a support group that met weekly for people dealing with stalking and intimate partner harassment. The group was facilitated by her colleague and met at the community center on Thursday evenings, and she thought it might help me to connect with others who understood what I was going through. I felt nervous about going because I'd never been to any kind of support group before, and I didn't know if I wanted to share my story with strangers. But I also felt isolated and alone in this experience. Like nobody in my regular life could really understand the fear I was living with. I told Faye I'd think about it and then spent the next 2 days going back and forth before finally deciding to attend the next meeting. Thursday evening, I drove to the community center and found the room where the group met, and there were about 8 other people sitting in a circle of chairs. Everyone looked normal and regular, not like victims or broken people, and that somehow made me feel better about being there. The woman running the group introduced herself as Carol and explained that this was a safe space to share experiences and support each other without judgment. She had Faye's same last name, and I wondered if they were related, but I didn't ask because Carol was already asking if anyone wanted to share what brought them to group. A woman across from me started talking about her ex who wouldn't stop calling her workplace, and another person shared about someone following them home from the grocery store. When it was my turn, I gave a brief version of my situation with Marco, the impersonation and threats and ongoing court case, and everyone nodded like they understood exactly what I meant. Hearing other people's stories made me feel less alone, because I realized my situation wasn't unique or special. It was just one version of a pattern that happened to lots of people. Some of the stories were worse than mine, involving physical violence or years of stalking, and I felt almost guilty that my experience wasn't as bad. Carol noticed my expression and said that trauma isn't a competition, and everyone's fear is valid regardless of how it compares to others. By the end of the meeting, I knew I wanted to keep coming back because this was the only place where I didn't have to explain or justify why I was scared. The weeks started to blur together after that, following a routine of therapy on Tuesdays and support group on Thursdays with work filling the time in between. I was getting better at managing the anxiety and sleeping more than a few hours a night, though I still checked the locks multiple times before bed. My mom had stopped hovering over me constantly, and we'd settled into a comfortable living arrangement where we respected each other's space. 3 months after Marco's arrest, I was working at my laptop when my phone rang with a number I recognized as the district attorney's office. The assistant DA told me that Marco's lawyer had approached them about a possible plea deal, and Marco was willing to plead guilty to reduce charges in exchange for probation and mandatory counseling. He would avoid jail time but would get a criminal record and have to stay on probation for at least 2 years. She explained the details of the offer and asked what I thought about it, whether I wanted them to push for trial or accept the deal. I sat there holding the phone feeling completely torn about what to say. Part of me wanted Marco to face serious consequences and go to jail for what he'd done to me, wanted him to suffer the way he'd made me suffer. But another part of me was exhausted from months of court dates and police reports and living in fear, and I just wanted it to be over so I could move on with my life. The assistant DA seemed to sense my hesitation and explained that going to trial was risky and time-consuming, sometimes taking over a year to get a court date, and then requiring me to testify in front of a jury, while Marco's lawyer tried to tear apart my credibility. The plea deal guaranteed he would have a criminal record and be on probation with strict conditions, whereas a trial could result in him being found not guilty and walking away with nothing. She said I should take some time to think about it and talk it over with people I trusted before making a decision. I called my therapist and asked if I could have an emergency session to talk through the plea deal decision. She helped me work through my conflicting feelings, acknowledging that wanting justice and wanting peace were both valid, but might not be compatible in this situation. Then I called Gavin from Legal Aid, who had helped me organize evidence early on, and he gave me his practical legal perspective on the pros and cons of accepting versus rejecting the deal. After talking it through with both of them, I realized that what I wanted most was for Marco to stay away from me and get help, so he wouldn't do this to someone else. I called the assistant DA back and told her I was okay with the plea deal, as long as it included a requirement that Marco stay away from me permanently and complete a batterer's intervention program that specifically addressed his behavior. She said she would make sure those conditions were written into the plea agreement and would send me a copy to review before Marco signed it. The assistant DA called me 2 days later to confirm that Marco signed the plea agreement and the hearing was scheduled for the following week. I felt this weird mix of relief and disappointment because part of me wanted him to face a jury and have everyone hear what he did, but another part just wanted it over so I could start rebuilding my life. The morning of the plea hearing, I got dressed in simple professional clothes and drove to the courthouse with my mom, who insisted on coming even though I told her she didn't have to. We sat in the back of the courtroom while the judge called several other cases first, and I watched Marco sit at the defense table with his lawyer looking smaller and quieter than I'd ever seen him. When they called his case, Marco stood before the judge and answered questions in a flat voice, admitting he was guilty of criminal harassment and making terroristic threats. The judge asked if he understood the terms of his probation, the community service hours, the mandatory counseling, and the restitution he owed me for therapy and security costs. Marco said yes to everything, though his jaw was tight and his hands were clenched at his sides. The whole hearing took maybe 15 minutes and then it was done. I didn't have to testify or face cross-examination or relive any of the details in front of strangers. Walking out of that courthouse, I felt like I could breathe a little deeper, like maybe the constant panic that had been sitting on my chest for months was finally starting to lift. My therapist told me during our next session that the hypervigilance and anxiety would fade gradually as time passed without new incidents, that my brain needed to learn I was actually safe now. I started looking at apartment listings online that same week, searching neighborhoods on the opposite side of town where Marco had never been and didn't know anyone. My mom supported the idea of me living independently again, but made me promise to get a good security system and check in with her every single day. I spent hours scrolling through listings, rejecting anything on the first floor or with easy access points, looking specifically for buildings with controlled entry and camera systems. 5 months after everything started with those fake messages to my coworkers, I found a small one-bedroom apartment in a quiet building with a doorbell camera, secured parking garage, and a super who actually seemed to care about tenant safety. Moving in felt like reclaiming something I'd lost, like proving to myself that Marco hadn't destroyed my ability to live my own life. I was careful not to post anything on social media about my new place, didn't update my address anywhere public, and only gave the location to my mom and a couple of trusted friends. My work performance reviews came back in early fall, and my manager commented on my resilience and professionalism during what she called a difficult personal situation. It felt good to know I'd managed to keep my career on track even while my personal life was complete chaos, that I hadn't let Marco ruin that part of my life too. At support group that week, I shared my story about getting through the legal process and finding a new place to live, and some of the newer members told me afterward that hearing it gave them hope. Carol pulled me aside after the meeting and mentioned that I might consider becoming a peer mentor once I felt ready, helping other people navigate what I'd gone through. The idea scared me a little because I still felt like I was barely holding it together some days, but it also felt meaningful to think I could help someone else feel less alone. I'm not going to pretend everything is perfect now because I still have moments where I hear a car door slam, and my heart starts racing. Still check my locks 3 times before bed. Still feel that spike of fear when my phone buzzes with an unknown number. I'm still rebuilding my sense of safety and learning to trust that Marco will actually follow his probation conditions and stay away from me. But I have a protective order that's good for another 7 months. Marco has a criminal record that will follow him forever. I have my own secure apartment, and a job that's been supportive, and I'm connected to people at support group who understand what I survived. I'm not the same person I was before all this started, before I woke up to those messages and realized my boyfriend had been impersonating me to manipulate people. I'm more cautious now, more aware of red flags, less willing to make excuses for behavior that makes me uncomfortable. But I'm also stronger than I thought I could be, more capable of advocating for myself and using the systems that exist to protect people like me. And I'm finally starting to believe that I'm going to be okay, that this won't define the rest of my life, that I can build something good and safe from here. Well, that's another story to add to my list of questionable decisions. If you're still here, you clearly have a tolerance for chaos. I respect that. Subscribe and let's keep this train wreck going.